When I ask someone what the least useful item in Ocarina of Time is, there's typically only one answer that people give: the ice arrows. They're from an optional dungeon so late in the game that you may never fire a single arrow before you beat the final boss, and even when you do, you'll probably be disappointed with the results. As we've learned over the years, Ocarina of Time had a very messy development, so I'm going to tell you why the ice arrows are at the heart of a panic that changed everything about the game only months before the release. So it's pretty well known that Bongo Bongo has a secret animation when you hit him with the ice arrows, and the reason this is a secret is because most people don't even know the ice arrows exist when they do Shadow Temple. The ice arrows are found at the end of the Gerudo Training Grounds, which is an optional dungeon you unlock on the way to the Spirit Temple. If you're like me, you probably didn't even complete the Gerudo Training Grounds on your first few playthroughs because it's kind of painful and basically made of puzzle rooms. Besides, you're mostly just passing through to get to the Spirit Temple anyway, so it's pretty easy to ignore as an inconvenient optional dungeon. The Zelda series is no stranger to optional stuff, but in retrospect, the Gerudo Training Grounds was actually the first optional dungeon in the series, which begs the question, was it truly always intended to be optional? And what if the ice arrows were something you were supposed to use much more often? At this point, you may be wondering to yourself, what uses do the ice arrows even have? They don't freeze water like they do in Majora's Mask, but they do freeze enemies. Not every enemy, mind you, but most of them. They freeze Stalfos and Dynalfos and Keese and Slugs, but the crazy thing is, they can actually freeze Gerudo guards. This shouldn't ever really be possible, since you need to be on friendly terms with the Gerudo to even reach the ice arrows, and shooting a Gerudo after that just acts as a normal NPC would. The fact that the freezing effect is programmed on the Gerudo guards suggests that at some point, the developers intended for the possibility of you using them on the guards, which means the ice arrows must have been placed somewhere else while the game was still being developed. When you really think about it, why do the Gerudo guards have the ice arrows anyway? It is said that the ice arrows are their prized treasure, but nothing about the Gerudo suggests they would possess or even value ice arrows. The majority of the training grounds is actually made of lava and fire, so if anything, they would definitively be weak to the ice arrows, which, according to their programmed response, they are. But you know where it does make sense for the ice arrows to be? The ice caverns. And you know what does make sense to be the Gerudo's prized treasure? The iron boots. To say we've learned a lot about Ocarina of Time over the years is an understatement. In fact, it very well might be one of the most cracked games of all time. It had a prolific renaissance as a top speed game, rocking the world with glitches that manipulate the game down to its very code. There's been tons of uncovered beta files that showed a bunch of unused items, development progress, dungeons, cutscenes, and even an R-Wing left in from a test build. We've also got plenty of interviews from the industry legends that speak passionately of the time they spent working on Ocarina of Time. In the 2011 Iwata Asks interview between Satoru Iwata and the core development team of Ocarina of Time, Iwata asks how the items and weapons were made. Immediately, Koizumi responds, "With regards to the items, we made each one because we thought it would be nice to have something like this." And everyone would say, "Well, where should we put it?" Aonuma mentions with a chuckle that even if they had an item, they wouldn't know where to put it, and that they decided the number of items at the start, but that just ended up causing trouble. This is likely to match the amount of memory the game had for inventory space, as we've learned through exploring glitches like Bottle Adventure. Aonuma says later on that it was a mess right up to the end. What catches my eye is what is said next. When asked how they felt about things constantly changing, they respond, "Even after the game was basically done, a lot had to be switched in. For example, you know that item in that one dungeon? Well, we need to use that in another dungeon." That stuff tends to concentrate around the end of development. The script changed in one way after another, or rather, it changed drastically. So while we don't know exactly which items were changed, the statement does give us a lot to work with in this theory. Namely that late in the game's development, a dungeon item swap did occur, and it changed the plot in potentially drastic ways. Working backwards from this, we can assume that this item was in a later dungeon that had to be pulled forward. We can probably safely exclude the child section, as those dungeons were developed first, and the item requirements are minimal. It's almost certainly not Forest Temple, as so much of the game is designed around you having a bow, especially a near-finished form of the Forest Temple. We can safely count Fire Temple out simply because the hammer was never going to be anywhere else as it is tied to Darunia's story. We can also exclude the later dungeons of Shadow and Spirit, because it just wouldn't make much sense that the Mirror Shield would have been in the Shadow Temple, nor the Hover Boots in the Spirit Temple. This leaves the mid-game mini-dungeons and the Water Temple as the main culprits. So remaining items are the Lens of Truth, Long Shot, Iron Boots, and Ice Arrows. And let's be honest, we can probably drop the Lens of Truth too. Something worth mentioning is that while we don't have beta footage of all the dungeons, we do have beta footage of the Water Temple, and unlike the Fire Temple, it looks completely different and is entirely non-functional. There doesn't appear to be as much of an emphasis on swimming or sinking, with control of water being more reliant on room-based activities rather than the dungeon's water level itself. But it is in such an unfinished state that it could have become anything from there. Over the last few months of the game's development, it had to be reworked entirely into the dungeon we know it as today. It was in this rework that the long shot was made in order to section off certain pieces of the dungeon. What's interesting about the long shot is that it doesn't actually help with anything else in the game, and no other part of Ocarina of Time was developed with it in mind. While you can use it to cross the Gerudo Valley Bridge, Epona was the developer-intended method for this. The long shot itself is not mandatory anywhere in Shadow Temple nor Spirit Temple, and in some clever cases can even be used to skip things that actually are developer-intended. So I think not only can we count the long shot out from a late-game item swap, it's also highly likely that the Water Temple was redesigned very late in the development cycle to become a dungeon that suddenly required Iron Boots. This is actually hinted at by Enuma in another interview where he states, "We totally redid the Water Temple, and we were working all the way up until summer to fix situations where an item had become awkwardly positioned or what have you." He then goes on to talk directly about how Link needed to move at a certain speed to seem lively. This is a strange statement to immediately connect to, and seems to suggest that they just found a use for the Iron Boots, and they needed to adjust the game feel for an underwater environment, as well as the location of the item in the world to fit with the new Water Temple. The Ice Arrows and Iron Boots being swapped at birth is a very small tweak that actually changes a lot about how Ocarina of Time plays out. Namely, it shortens the game and makes a lot of what they thought mandatory in Ocarina of Time optional. If you were originally intended to do ice caverns for the Ice Arrows in order to infiltrate the Gerudo training grounds for the Iron Boots, the middle of the game would have an entire dedicated stealth section with a cool mechanic that freezes almost everything you come across. However, the time between the Fire Temple and the Water Temple would be pretty long and may bore some players, especially with how complicated the Gerudo training grounds is, not to mention how much more you'd have to manage magic as a resource to properly use the Ice Arrows. This would have made the game much longer and more complex, not to mention it would make having Epona actually required in order to get across the Gerudo Valley Bridge, and many people actually ended up skipping her entirely. The developers probably saw that having two mini-dungeons back-to-back was bad for the game's flow, so they decided to make the executive decision to make the Gerudo training grounds the optional one, and the ice caverns the required one by simply swapping the dungeon rewards. This ultimately is a very easy decision to make, since they always wanted an ice dungeon anyway, and still had the Spirit Temple to deliver the Gerudo aesthetic to the game. Having two Gerudo dungeons and no ice dungeon would be a bit of a bummer, so with one change, all these problems get solved pretty much at once. This is the kind of change that could have happened so late in development that the Ice Arrows features just became artifacts of a different way the game could have played out. But it's not just the gameplay that the devs were complaining about, they also felt the swap changed things about the story in a dramatic way. Let's think critically about the Iron Boots real quick, and how they relate to what we know about the Gerudo. The Gerudo are known to be skilled metalworkers. They make tons of gates and fences and unique weapons. Especially in Ocarina of Time, they are known for working decorative metals into clothing, such as their other cultural treasure, the Silver Gauntlets, which is kept hidden in the Spirit Temple. It's not much of a stretch to believe that the same people who made the Silver Gauntlets also made the Iron Boots. Hell, even the Iron Knuckles, which are Gerudo guards in armor, wear what must be Iron Boots, if the name is to be believed. Plus, if you look at Gerudo Training Grounds, it is genuinely designed with both the Silver Gauntlets and Iron Boots in mind. The Silver Gauntlets reveal a secret room on one far side of the dungeon, and the Iron Boots reveal a much darker secret on the other side. When you think about Gerudo Training Grounds, this room is probably not the first one that comes to mind. A sealed room with a deep pool of swirling water filled with man-eating clams makes for a fun enough obstacle in a video game, but if you put the Iron Boots in the Gerudo's possession just 2 rooms away, this room becomes a sort of low-tech torture chamber. Considering the Gerudo's history of capturing and jailing people who trespass their territory, after a certain time, they may take the prisoners to this room, and with the Iron Boots, leave them to swim with the fishes. Or in this case, sink to the clams. This is another one of those moments where Ocarina of Time can have some really dark subtext, but it's only there if you read between the lines. So this seems like a long way to go just to shoot the Ice Arrows once at Bongo Bongo, but there is another use the Ice Arrows have that suggests you're supposed to have them much earlier than people realize. While the ice arrows work on many enemies, there is one non-enemy that is frozen by them too: these metal sliders. We all know the metal sliders as a typical Zelda obstacle that mostly just exists to make rooms a little more annoying, sometimes incredibly so. However, shooting an ice arrow at them in fact freezes them in place. The problem is, by the time you have the ice arrows, there are not very many of these left in the game, and it's not stated anywhere that such a thing can be done. With the exception of the ones in Dodongo's Cavern as a child, these sliders don't appear anywhere in the game until the ice caverns, and then plenty after. In fact, if the ice arrows were the reward for the ice caverns, this metal slider would be the very first thing you see after getting them, with one spinning around the first room of the ice caverns that has a shortcut from the treasure room. There are actually a great handful of situations where freezing sliders would be useful to manage some of the more frustrating rooms in the game, such as the ramp up to Morpha, or the fan room in the Shadow Temple. It's not that the ice arrows are useless in Ocarina of Time, it's just that their uses were written out of the game by placing them in a location long after they would be useful. The ice arrows are useful against a multitude of enemies, especially if they have strong combat AI. They're useful at freezing guards in a stealth environment. They're useful at stopping otherwise unstoppable objects that make rooms really annoying. And if they were in the ice caverns, you would have them before you fought Bongo Bongo every single time. Looking through the interviews the developers gave over the years, it's clear that they were frustrated with the process, but knew they were making something entirely new and special. The two things that come up over and over is the true panic they faced in the last few months as things were coming together but still kept changing, and the reverence they had for the chance to make something entirely new. With how Ocarina of Time was developed, it's kind of a surprise it's as cohesive as it is. Sure, one dungeon is optional and the ice arrows may not get the love it could have, but the adventure we got was still one worth talking about decades later, and I'm sure we'll be finding even more mysteries in the game for years to come.